This series is titled God's Kingdom Order Under the Mountain of Governance. From the very foundation of creation, God established His kingdom order, a divine governance designed to reflect His glory and authority on earth. His original intention was clear. Mankind, created in His image, was designed to rule and reign, entrusted with dominion over all of creation. This series is a call to rediscover that purpose, to step into the authority God has given us, and to align our lives with His perfect plan. It's time to embrace the responsibility of kingdom governance and walk boldly in the power and purpose for which you and I were created. I will start with part 1. And this is what I like to call the divine design. At its core, God's original design for government was not human-centered, but it was God-centered. The Old Testament reveals that God intended to establish a theocracy. In this theocracy, God would be the direct king over His people, and these people would live in obedience to His laws, and they would reflect His character to the entire world. From the beginning, God is portrayed as the ultimate sovereign ruler over all of creation. His authority is absolute, and His reign is marked by justice, righteousness, and love. This is evident in Psalms 47:7-8 and Psalms 103 verse 19. In the Garden of Eden, God's rule was direct and flawless. His original plan was always to work through a man, giving him authority and responsibility to exercise dominion over creation. This is clearly seen when God formed Adam. He gave Adam specific instructions: what to do, how to do it, and what to avoid. And as long as Adam maintained and remained obedient to God and stayed connected to Him, everything functioned perfectly. Adam and Eve lived in complete harmony with God, with each other, and with creation. This was the ideal form of government, a kingdom where God's will was carried out on earth just as it is in heaven. God's government was always meant to be relational, not transactional. He established covenants with His people. And we see this with Noah, Abraham, Moses, and David to define their relationship with Him and their role in His kingdom. Now, my friends, the covenant at Mount Sinai in Exodus 19-20 formalized Israel's identity as a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. This was God's great idea, a people set apart to live under His rule and reflect His glory to the nations. Now, God had set a foundation of how people would live and interact. The Mosaic laws were not just a set of rules, but a divine constitution for God's kingdom. It provided a framework for justice, worship, and community life. This law ensured that God's character was reflected in every aspect of society. This law emphasized care for the vulnerable, fairness in judgment, and the centrality of worshiping God alone. It was designed to create a society where God's righteousness and justice were evident. Now, let us jump into part 2 of this series. And I like to call this the purpose of God's kingdom. God's vision for government was not just about maintaining order, but it was about fulfilling His redemptive purposes for humanity and creation. His great idea had several key purposes, and I'll list them one by one. And number 1, it was to reflect His glory. God's government was meant to showcase His character to the world. Israel, as His chosen people, was to be a light to the nations, demonstrating what it looked like to live under the rule of a just and loving God. The structure of governance, whether through judges, priests, kings, It was intended to reflect God's holiness, justice, and His mercy. Number 2, to establish justice and righteousness. Now, God's kingdom is characterized by justice and righteousness. His government was designed to protect the vulnerable, punish evil, and promote the flourishing of all people. Leaders, they were expected to rule with integrity, fairness, and seen in the instructions for kings in Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 14 to 20. They were to depend on God's wisdom, not their power or wealth. Number 3, bring peace. God's government was meant to bring shalom, a sense of holistic peace, harmony, and well-being. This peace extended the relationship between man and God and everyone else. The Sabbath laws, the Jubilee year, were designed to restore balance and prevent exploitation, ensuring that society functioned in alignment with God's will. Number 4, to foreshadow the ultimate kingdom. The Old Testament was a shadow of the ultimate kingdom of God, which would fully be realized through Jesus Christ. This Davidic covenant pointed to a future king who would establish an eternal kingdom of justice and peace. Now let us trace the unbroken thread of God's kingdom from Abraham to David. When we look back at Scripture, it is easy to see it as a collection of isolated stories about good people. But from a kingdom perspective, the Bible tells a single cohesive story about the king reclaiming his territory. In the beginning, God established a kingdom on earth through Adam. Adam was given dominion, which means authority to rule on God's behalf. However, when Adam fell, that authority was compromised, and the connection between heaven and earth, God and man, was fractured. But the king did not abandon his plan. He began looking for a man who could legally re-establish his government on earth. He found that man in Abraham. After the fall in Eden, humanity drifted farther from God's intent. But God, in His sovereignty, sought a partner to bring His kingdom culture back into the earthly realm. He didn't just need a worshiper. He needed an ambassador. He needed someone who would leave behind the systems of the world, represented by the Ur of the Chaldeans, and step into a new way of living. God's call to Abraham in Genesis 12 was not just a travel itinerary. It was a diplomatic assignment. Go from your country to the land I will show you. This was the first step in re-establishing a beachhead for God's kingdom. The most critical aspect of Abraham's life was not just his morality, but his covenant. So, you may be wondering, what does a covenant mean? What does it look like? Well, in kingdom, a covenant is a legal contract. When God made a covenant with Abraham, He was not just making a promise. He was binding Himself to a human being. This restored the authority structure that was lost with Adam. Through this covenant, God gave Abraham the legal right to operate with heaven's backing. God promised to make him a great nation. This kingdom language. God was not interested in just starting religion. He was building a nation that would reflect His nature and government to the rest of the entire world. Now, we often view faith as a mystical feeling. But Abraham, faith was practical obedience. When God spoke, Abraham moved. This obedience is the cornerstone of kingdom citizenship. A king speaks, and the citizens act. Abraham's willingness to offer Isaac was the ultimate test of his allegiance. It proved that he valued the king more than the promise itself. Because of this unwavering loyalty, God could trust him with the future of the redemptive plan. Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness, which is right standing with the government of heaven. The mandate given to Abraham was clear. In you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. This mirrors the original mandate given to Adam, to be fruitful and multiply. Abraham was called to be a conduit of God's rule. Wherever Abraham went, he built altars. These were not just religious monuments, they were declarations of ownership. He was staking a claim for Yahweh in a land filled with other gods. And now, guess what? The story of God's kingdom on earth doesn't end with Abraham. Actually, that is merely the beginning. Abraham established the legal precedent through covenant, a man partnering with God to restore his dominion. But a kingdom needs more than a patriarch. It needs people, a structure, and a government. The journey from Abraham's tent to David's throne reveals how God meticulously nurtured his kingdom plan through the generations, passing the baton of divine authority from father to son. The mantle of the covenant fell next on Isaac and then to his son Jacob. Where Abraham was a man of faith, Jacob was a man of struggle. His name meant supplanter, and he spent much of his early life striving in his own strength. Yet God is in the business of transforming character to align with calling. Jacob's defining moment came not in a moment of strength, but one of desperation at Peniel. After wrestling with God, he was renamed Israel, which means he struggles with God or God prevails. This was not just a name change, it was a shift in identity. Jacob moved from being a manipulator to a prince of God. He learned that true kingdom authority is not grabbed, but received through surrender. His 12 sons would become the foundation for the 12 tribes of Israel, the very framework of the nation God was building. Jacob's life shows us that God does not require perfection, but a willingness to be broken and remade by him to carry his purpose. So Jacob finished what he was meant to do, and the baton was passed on to his son. And who was his son? Joseph. Now, Joseph is a symbol of dominion through administration. And you may be asking yourself, how is this? Now, before kingdom had a physical throne in Israel, God needed to demonstrate that his rule is not limited by geography or political circumstances. Through the lives of Joseph, and then later on, but parallel in narrative, Daniel, God revealed how kingdom citizens can exercise dominion even within the heart of hostile pagan empires. They represent the archetype of the kingdom governor. Of all of Jacob's sons, Joseph's story is a masterclass in kingdom governance. Sold into slavery and unjustly imprisoned, Joseph was placed in the heart of the world's most powerful empire, Egypt. He didn't carry a sword or lead an army, but he operated with profound wisdom and administrative skill. This was his expression of dominion. In prison, he managed the affairs of other prisoners. In Potiphar's house, he ran the entire estate. When Potiphar elevated him, Joseph didn't just interpret a dream. He provided a detailed strategic plan to save the nation from famine. He demonstrated that kingdom authority is not always overt. It often works quietly within existing systems, bringing divine order and wisdom to bear on practical problems. Joseph's stewardship saved an entire nation and in turn preserved the covenant family from whom the king would eventually come. He was a governor operating under God's authority long before Israel even had a king. Now, centuries later, Daniel replicated this model in Babylon. Exiled as a youth, he purposed in his heart not to defile himself with the king's culture. He and his friends demonstrated a superior wisdom that baffled the world's wisest counselors. Daniel's refusal to bow to Nebuchadnezzar's idol or cease his prayers to Yahweh showed that a citizen of heaven operates under a higher law. Both Joseph and Daniel proved that dominion is not always about overt power. It is often about bringing divine solutions, impeccable character, and unshakable faithfulness into systems that are foreign to God, thereby demonstrating the superiority of his kingdom. Now, my friends, after Joseph rested with his father, the baton passed from individuals to a collective. In Egypt, the children of Israel grew from a family into a multitude. Through Moses, God delivered them not just from bondage, but for a purpose. We know at Mount Sinai, God declared his intent. You shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. You can read this for yourself in Exodus 19. This was the formal charter for God's national government on earth. They were given the law, the constitution of the kingdom, which provided the blueprint for a society that would reflect God's justice, righteousness, and holiness to the world. For generations, this nation was led by judges, men and women raised up by God to deliver and guide his people. But the people, they eventually tired of this divine arrangement. They looked at the surrounding nations and they wanted a king they could see. It is important to note here that Israel's desire for a human king was driven by a combination of practical concerns and deeper spiritual issues. This reflected a shift away from the unique identity as God's covenant people. This request for a king revealed both their longing for worldly security and their struggle to trust in Yahweh's kingship. Now, one of the primary reasons Israel wanted a king was military security. They wanted someone to fight their battles. The looming threat of powerful standing armies from nations like Egypt, Philistia, made Israel's ad hoc tribal militias seem a bit inadequate. A dynastic monarch promised a permanent mobilized military force that could provide the stability and protection they craved so badly. Another reason was the desire for judicial consistency. Samuel's sons, who had been appointed as judges, were corrupt and perverted justice. The people believed that a king could offer centralized, impartial courts and bring order back to the society. They saw a monarchy as a solution to the failure of their current system. Israel also sought cultural conformity. They wanted to be like other nations. Surrounding kingdoms like Moab, Ammon, and Tyre appeared stable, powerful, and grand. The visible symbols of their kings, palaces, armies, and wealth were attractive to Israel. Socially and culturally, they longed for the status and security that seemed to come from having a king, even though this meant that they had to abandon their distinctiveness as God's chosen people. However, it is important to note here that beneath these practical reasons lay deeper spiritual issues. At its core, their request for a king was a rejection of Yahweh's kingship. God interpreted their demand as a personal rejection. And this is what he said: "They have rejected me as their king." The theocracy God had established was not deficient. Rather, it was Israel's unbelief and lack of trust in God that led them to seek a human ruler. Their decision was also driven by fear-driven pragmatism. And despite God's promise in Numbers 10:9 to defend them in battle, their faith faltered in the face of external threats. Instead of relying on God's divine protection, they sought a human solution. In Hosea, it reflects God's judgment on this decision. And this is what he said: "I gave you a king in my anger." Finally, their request revealed a desire for worldly emulation of a covenant distinctiveness. God had called Israel to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, set apart from the surrounding cultures. By asking for a king, they abandoned their unique identity and sought to assimilate into the patterns of the world, prioritizing human systems over their covenant relationship with God. So what am I saying? In summary, Israel's desire for a human king was rooted in their longing for security, order, and cultural status. But it ultimately reflected a deeper spiritual failure, a rejection of God's kingship, a lack of faith in his promises, and a willingness to trade their covenant distinctiveness for worldly conformity. My friends, does this sound like the church today? Samuel warned Israel that choosing a human king would come at a cost: conscription, heavy taxes, and servitude. The warning became reality under Solomon, whose forced labor policies eventually led the northern tribes' rebellion. And the lesson is clear: rejecting God's rule in pursuit of autonomy often results in greater oppression. Though the request for a king was rooted in human insecurity, God used it to advance his kingdom plan. After the failed leadership of Saul, God sought a man who understood the true nature of kingship. And guess where he found him? He found him in a shepherd boy named David, a man after his own heart. The narrative trajectory from Abraham's covenant, Jacob's transformation, and the administrative wisdom of Joseph and Daniel finds its Old Testament climax in David. David represents the fusion of all these elements into the archetype of the king. Now let's jump into the king after God's own heart. Now God looked past all the tall and handsome sons of Jesse and chose a shepherd boy, a youth, whose private life of worship and courage had prepared him for public leadership. David's heart posture is what set him apart. He was a warrior and a strategist, but above all, he was a worshiper. He understood the secret that his predecessor Saul never grasped. The earthly throne is merely a footstool for the heavenly one. David's first significant act as king over a united Israel was not political reform, but a spiritual one. He brought the Ark of the Covenant, the symbol of God's manifest presence, into the heart of the capital, Jerusalem. David danced before the Lord, in all his might, showing that he saw his kingship not as a position of privilege, but as a platform for ministry to the Lord. He united the political and spiritual centers of the nation, establishing a government that, for a time, reflected the righteous order of heaven. Because David was a man after God's own heart, God established the Davidic covenant with him, promising a descendant who would sit on the throne forever. This promise elevated the vision of God's people. The earthly kingdom of David, with all its glory, now understood to be a shadow, a prototype, pointing towards the ultimate Son of David, Jesus Christ himself, who would one day come to take the government upon his shoulders and establish a perfect, eternal kingdom that will have no end. Now, as I come to a close, I want to ask you, do you see it? Do you see how much God has been continuously trying since the time of old to find a man who, like David, would rule with the scepter of his strength? The unbroken thread of God's kingdom is not just a story from the past. It's a call to action for the present. From Abraham to David and ultimately to Jesus Christ, God has been weaving his unstoppable plan, a kingdom that cannot be shaken. The question is, will you recognize your place in it? David's throne was never the end game. It was a shadow, a glimpse of the eternal reign of the true King, Jesus, who now calls you to live under his rule. This is not a passive invitation, it's a challenge. Will you align your life with the King whose government will never end? Or will you stand on the sidelines of history? The thread is unbroken and the kingdom is advancing. The only question left is, will you be a part of it?